Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Stan Veuger. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'm delighted to host this event on the Inter-American Development Bank's role in promoting development, productivity, and growth in Latin America. A warm welcome as well to our online viewership. If you are one of the online viewers, please submit your questions to beatrice.lee@aei.org or via Twitter with hashtag AskAEIEcon. Latin America's economies face grave challenges, including high inflation, deep inequalities, climate change, inflation gets better, and persistently low productivity growth. Charged with helping them meet these challenges is the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB, a multilateral financial institution that's a leading source of development finance for Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, I'm delighted to welcome the president of the IDB to AEI, Ilan Goldfajn. Dr. Goldfajn was elected IDB president in November last year, just after participating in a different AEI event. So it's a good career booster. He previously served as director of the Western Hemisphere Department of the IMF and as governor of the Brazilian Central Bank, in addition to a number of other senior roles in the private sector, in public service and in academia. Today's event is going to consist of two parts. First, we'll hear from President Goldfajn. After his opening remarks, we'll have a conversation. We'll take questions from all of you, from people on the internet. And then after that, we will disappear. Part two of the festivities will commence. A panel discussion moderated by my colleague, Steve Kamin, who will be joined by Ana Maria Ibanez, Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, and Nancy Lee. Steve will introduce them at a bit more length. They'll talk amongst themselves, take more of your questions. But first, President Goldfajn, welcome. I look forward to your remarks. You want to speak from there? You want to
No,
just?
I don't know. You run the show.
I was going to give you. All right. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this. I wanted to first, for people who are not entirely familiar, I wanted to give you a chance to just talk about the Inter-American Development Bank, about its mission and its work in the region. And then we can talk a little more about your vision for the institution. And just for this opening question, please take whatever time you think is reasonable.
Thank you very much, Stan, and thank you all for being here, also people online. For me, it's an honor. You mentioned last time I was here, then I changed jobs. I'm not planning to change jobs again. I'm very happy where I am. I'm starting my mandate is 5 years, so I'm very happy to be here. IDB, Inter-American Development Bank. Some of you know very well. Some of you just heard about it. We are basically the most important banking institution, development banking institution in the region. We are the ones that lend most to the region. We have both a public arm and a private arm. We have the IDB and we have the IDB Invest. And we also have a smaller operation with the IDB Lab. The IDB Invest basically finances the private sector, provided that the private sector actually has an impact on development. And development means social, education, health, poverty, inequality. It also means infrastructure and other issues that we can talk about. The IDB Lab is more about a venture capital, where we take risky positions in order to generate innovations. And the region is a region that lacks productivity growth, and that's a way for us to be there. IDB has a very important role. The way I understand it is has dual role. It is the institution that is very close to the countries, to the governments. You can call it the partner of choice, if you want to say it in English, but in Spanish or Portuguese, you can say the Banco Amigo is the bank that's very close to them, because we have offices in all the countries in the region. There was a decision in the past to decentralize and have a good part of our staff in the ground. And that actually, I think it was a very good decision. The second part, besides being very close to the region and being very helpful, is that we are a conduit, a bridge between the region and the rest of the world. We have 48 members of IDB, being 26 from the region, but 22 from outside, and these 22 includes European, Asian, and others. So it's very important to have this conduit in a region that tends to be more isolated than the rest. When you look at trade, when you look about how you integrate. So this part of conduit is very, very important. The other thing that I believe is important to raise about IDB in this initial introduction is that IDB was created 60 years ago. It was created by the US with the countries in the region, and the idea was integrated Americas. I think we still have this philosophy of having an integrated America, having an integrated region, and this is still a very important thing. Now, what are the instruments for us to affect the region? One of them, of course, is the lending. When we have 48 members, we're able to issue resources from our capital at a very lower cost than most of the countries in the region. That gives an advantage that you can lend long-term at a AAA rate, which is something that we can always provide to the countries. However, what is most important than that is the fact that the lending or even the technical assistance we provide comes with what we call knowledge, capacity. We transfer to the region quite a bit of the knowledge. Either we have it from here and from the rest of the world and have it this conduit, but even between themselves. Something that is successful in one place, we can adopt in another place. And that transfer of knowledge, in my view, tends to be even more permanent than the lending. The lending takes 10 years, 15 years sometimes, but the knowledge sometimes tends to be even more permanent. And finally, I think we need to mention, and it is very important, as well as the AEI, we have values. I think we share values, democratic values, free enterprise, rule of law, transparency, favor strong institutions. That part is not a marginal part of what IDB does. We do have what we call policy lending, where you lend in order to establish these institutions. So you lend and you provide assistance to have, an independent central bank, or you provide assistance to have a new tax system, or you provide assistance and lending to have a transition in terms of climate change, transition energy in the country. You have to have a plan. So that's also very important. The values and the fact that you're creating institutions. And to close, I believe that what we do provide the countries some continuity that is helpful for the private sector. The private sector, when I talk to them, when I talk to the entrepreneurs, and you know I have been in the private sector, public sector, private sector, so I know how to interact and I know what they care, and I say, what can I help you to mobilize resources and help the region in the development? And the answer is stability, rule of law, institutions. And that's, I think, a very important role of the IDB. So let me stop here before I get to our new priorities. But I think you're giving me an opportunity just to present the IDB. So I think that's a very stylized facts introduction of the IDB.
So there's two quick questions I wanted to ask you about this broad overview. First of all, when you think about integrating the Americas, what's the role you see there for Canada and the US? How do you see their place in that vision of of an integrated Americas? And then secondly, on policy lending, it's obviously something the European Union has struggled with a lot, which has, which has a lot of instruments, but has really struggled to come to an agreement on what direction to go into. How does that process work within the IDB? How do you agree on policy objectives? So it's one thing to have tools, it's another thing to come to an agreement on what the goals are. Are those two things you could
So those are very,
yeah.
very important questions, both of them. On the role of the US and Canada, as I mentioned, IDB was born with the US, with Canada. The role is very clear. I mean, we have quite a bit of integrated in terms of economy. We need to integrate more, but today we know that let me just give you a number, FDI to the region, 40% comes from the US in the last 5 years. So that's a number, 40%. So that's used to be even higher, but we still quite a bit. You have a very large trade with the US, still a very large trade with the US. You have values together. So when we talk about democracy, when we talk about rule of law, this is something that unites the region. And that's something that I believe there is an important role of that. So if we want to have an integrated America in a world that has the risk of being fragmented, with the polarization of everything, it is important that we speak the same language, same values, that we provide development together. And there's some issues that we care together. I can give you some on migration. IDB is very involved in that, in providing the conditions for the population to have roots in the countries. So we have programs in Central America about returning migrants. We have programs that give skills to be able to provide jobs and value in the region. So there are issues that are joint issues. Another issue that's more recent, city security, big issue in the region now. A bit of more violence or organized crimes and gangs. This is on the rise. We are one of the few institutions that had a security unit, not from today, we did not invent it today, but they have knowledge for decades of knowledge, and we can provide solutions and we can be integrated in that moment, and that's important for Latin America and Caribbean, that's important for the US, that's important. Same thing with migration, we have our unit of migration. So I just gave you two examples where we can work together, but in general, the development of Latin America, Caribbean is important for the whole region in today's world.
For sure.
So that was the first.
And now the second one.
So the second one is about policy loans. How do we know that when we lend is good? How do we know that when we provide resources is going to come in the way we want? First, we need to think about the design. We need to somehow separate when we are giving resources as just a liquidity providers or when we actually want to change institutions, to strengthen institutions. That's a very different role. We are not the IMF, and maybe I don't need to provide you with examples and introduction of what does an IMF does. But I was there last year. The last time I was here was an IMF Western director. So I can tell you the role is provide assistance, balance of payment assistance, or budget assistance in moments of crisis in exchange for some conditionality so that the country takes, so that they can pay back the IMF, but also that they can get out of the balance of payment crisis or out of the budgetary problems. That's an important role, and the IDB is willing to help, but providing long-term help with technical assistance to make sure that you have the right regulations, for example, to develop an important carbon market. That's the IDB. when you're thinking about the transition to new minerals, clean minerals, lithium and all of that, that's us to help. So we need to be able to provide what we call the result, the matrix or the additionality, or what I'm going to like to call the impact. We need to be sure, not only at the beginning, but in the middle and at the end, that you're really having the impact you want. And just to close, it is very easy for all that says we lend 25 billions per year. Next year we're going to lend 27, and then we're going to go to 30, and we'll be happy that we're just lending this money. But this was just a proxy of the impact on the lives of people. What we really want to know is if this lending actually meant that we have more people out of poverty, that we have more fresh water to people, that people have more jobs, that we get the productivity to go up, and so on and on. So we cannot forget the last mile, which is getting the impact. We cannot just be happy with the lending. The lending is just a tool. The technical assistance is just a tool. What we really want to make is a difference in the impact.
And so this is where we come to your vision and priorities.
Okay, good.
How are you going to make that impact?
So first, you have to be selective. What I have learned from my past jobs, I tend to call it past lives, is that if you want to do everything, you reach nothing. If everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And when we get to these jobs, the amount of demands and necessities is huge. So you tend to incorporate everything. You say, yeah, come in, let's do it. We're going to do everything. But at the end of the day, you don't get impact. So we need to choose. So we now under, that's my first year, we are now under a revision of our strategy. We call it the institutional strategy, where we start with what are the objectives, areas we're going to focus. Then we go from this to, on those areas, what is the project? But then we have to tell our staff, how do we get there? So we have a lot of reforms, priorities, way to do it, and then how to do it. Priorities. First, social, that's core IDB. There's no way you can be a development bank and you don't care about health. But you can think about health in several ways, and you can concentrate in, for example, digital health. Health in distance, where we care about people that are not so connected physically, but they can actually have a connection, and they can get the health. Education. Also, we have experiences in Brazil, in the Amazon, where you can educate in a very important way if you do it. If you can do it virtually, and you can reach people. We learned that just digital with a screen doesn't work. You need to have somebody there with somebody else, be the professor, and then the digital works.
I think we learned that here too during the pandemic. Yeah.
So that's the social, number one. Number two, they're global public goods. So there's no way that Latin America and the Caribbean are not involved in climate, not only the Paris targets and thinking about the transition, but also adaptation. I think the region has learned, at least this year, if it has not before, that you got more hurricanes in the Caribbean, that you are getting droughts in Uruguay and Argentina, that you got fires in Chile, that you got smokes in fires in Canada and smokes to DC. So I believe the region now learned.
The smoke situation is definitely something I learned about this year. I didn't realize that was an option.
And I was traveling. I was traveling, but everybody else's stuff was actually sick. So I believe now the region understands that a priority for us needs to be dealing with climate and all global. And last but not least, you need to generate resources. And if you don't know about the IDB, you have heard about lost decades in Latin America. And lost decade means that you have not grown enough. Productivity growth has been. So we need to care about it because this is the only way you get resources to care about social, to care about climate. So how do you get productivity? We talk about regional integration. We call about getting the private sector to help. Those are the ways you can try to, and productivity growth to do it. Let me just mention again that in this priority, there are some cross-cutting issues. Institutional rule of law, again, I'm going to insist, it's very important for us. Number 2, knowledge bank. Number 3, being able of development effectiveness, which is basically impact.
I see. And so let's take it from that level to the second level that you described.
Okay, sure.
The more the implementation level than the high level objectives. There, what do you think of as opportunities to really make a difference in productivity or in social outcomes? What do you think the big challenges are for the IDB, for the region? Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Yeah.
So let me start with the challenges, then I'll get into opportunities. I think the region has a triple challenge. It's one of the most unequal, and where the societies are now feeling that they're not getting the services that they would like. And what used to be, well, we are improving and we're going to get there, societies in the region are now, citizens in the region are now saying, I don't want to wait. And we can feel this impatience by the changes in governments, by the protests, by the streets. So the first challenge is that the social issues are there on the flesh.
And you think people are less optimistic than they were 20 years ago about?
I think what they're saying is that I want to get from my house to my work in less than 2 hours, and I want it tomorrow. I don't want to wait for the next 10 years. And they're saying, I had a pandemic, and I felt that maybe I was not given the right vaccines on time, or was not given the health. So somehow they're saying, I want some different leaders, or I want some different attention. So that's a social that was always there, now is on the rise. Second challenge is that the authorities, they're elected, but they don't have the fiscal resources to do everything. Why? Debts are on the rise because of the pandemic, so before. Fiscal are constrained because not all the government can just finance themselves easily. So social demands are on the rise, fiscal resources are limited. Number 3, create those resources. But then we go back to the lost decades. If you don't have productivity growth, you don't create it. So this is the triple challenge. A lot of demands, social demands, no fiscal resources,
no growth.
And you're not growth. How do you deal with it? In addition, then you get the global challenges, the climate. People are moved from their houses because there's a flood or things like that. So that's the challenge. So you may ask, where is the opportunity in all of this? I think the opportunity is that I believe that the region is now very close to an inflection point. Why? Because it seems to me that Latin America now is part of, and the Caribbean is part of the global solutions to some very important global public goods. And I can give you 3 of them. 1, clean energy. People realize that we need clean energy, we don't have time, there's an inflection point, and this inflection point translates to an inflection point for the region. The region has more clean energy than any other place in the world. It's basically the double of alternative energy, clean energy than anybody else. We have places like Central America that you have almost 100% coming from clean sources or alternatives. In Brazil, for example, it's 50%.
And a lot of this is hydro, or what's
You have hydro, you have solar, you have wind, aeolic, and you have all of that. So that's, and of course, there's a lot of hydric because of some part of it is the initial conditions, but it's there. So if you work it properly, you may be able to export this clean energy. How do you export it? For example, green hydrogen that comes from clean energy, then you can export. And the rest of the world is actually looking for example, Europe, they need a transition out of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They need to transfer. Latin America is the partner that they're looking for providing. So global good, clean energy, you could be the main export of that, and that brings a boom. And we know that when you get a boom, investment boom, that translates into more revenues for the government, that translates into development. So number two, food insecurity. Major issue globally. 40% of the trade, global trade, comes from Latin America. 40%.
in food? Okay.
In food. Okay. Today, you can feed, just from what is produced in South America mostly, you can feed twice the population. We haven't distributed well, so you still have insecurity in the region. But if you seize the opportunity and you increase productivity there, you can feed good part of the world. That's number two. Number three, biodiversity. Amazon is there, Flores is there. This is a place, this is what the world is valuing to. Number four, clean minerals. Lithium, and this is 2/3 of the lithium comes from lithium. So when you number, you see that there's an opportunity.
This is a good approach where you do only 3 challenges and 4 opportunities. It's a good way to radiate optimism. That's good.
I usually do 3 and 3.
Yeah. No,
that's the first time I did the 4, maybe to pass more optimism.
Yeah.
So the issue is there is an opportunity there, but let me somehow moderate optimism. That's not the first time that the region has opportunities. And you can easily lose the opportunities. So what is our role here is to realize that there is an inflection coming from a global inflection, coming from a climate inflection, coming also from a political willingness globally and in the region, and we need to seize this opportunity. And I take it as the IDB to help this happen. But we need the governments, we need the authorities, we need the US and Canada, we need everybody to look at it and says, this is the moment and we need to make it happen. But you can lose the opportunity and we're going to have another lost decade and we'll just be here another 10 years and you're going to ask the next IDB president.
That's
and
right. What happened over this past decade? We had all the opportunities and they didn't happen. And so in those areas, what do you think the IDB, how do you see the IDB's role in making sure that those opportunities are realized?
So one of them I mentioned to you is the conduit with the rest of the world. So there are a lot of investments that can happen, and the IDB is an anchor for a lot of the investments. An anchor is not only for government investment, it's also an anchor for mobilizing private capital. So we are there, and people say, well, if the IDB is there with their standards, with the transparency, with the procurement, we are happy to be there. They provide us some light on the investments we do and the fact that they will be more safe in the future. So we provide this anchor. Number two, I mentioned the knowledge. We need to be the ones that provide the knowledge and help to the countries. Number three, we are also ones that could help mobilize the public development banks together to cooperate for the region. So you may say, why is the IDB going to do with this? Well, first, that we're already doing it. We just had an agreement, an important agreement with the World Bank. We signed a memorandum of understanding on very precise points, not just, I always say that, well, there are some MOUs that are basically vows. You know, I love you and I will live with you forever. That's not the MOU that we signed. We signed on 3 priorities. One, we're going to cooperate within Amazon, biodiversity. We're going to cooperate in the Caribbean to deal with resilience. And we're going to cooperate in the digital world, specifically on education, where we feel that we can contribute more. There are some projects, pipelines, people working, and Maria can tell you more in the next panel about that. So we are working on cooperation. We are also working on cooperating with our major shareholders. So we just launched the Bid for the Americas. As you know, bid is the IDB in Spanish, but it is also bidding for the Americas. So we want the companies to bid for the Americas. And we had a programs where we provide information on the procurement, on where are the businesses. We need more companies from the US, from Canada, but even from Europe to come to the region.
And that would presumably help with productivity as well.
It will help productivity, it will help with the values we share, and that's important. And just next week, we're gonna share a conference with the US government. This is the APET, the Prosperity for an Economic, American Prosperity for the, whatever.
Yeah.
This is what we're doing together with the 10 countries. We're doing the business part of it. Government is doing with the countries. We're bringing them, we're bringing the companies, we're bringing the governments. We're going to have 6 or 7 heads of state just in our premises, where we're going to talk about the opportunities and how we can.
And that's procurement oriented in particular.
It's business oriented.
Okay, business.
There's procurement, there's financing, there's trade, there's investment.
So on trade, I wanted to hear your thoughts on what you think about further liberalization, what scope there is for that. Obviously, we've seen, a bit of a turn against free trade in the U.S. and in some European countries as well. There is a long-standing attempt, I think, to come up with an EU-Mercosur trade agreement. Of course, there's tension around NAFTA. Where do you think that is going? Do you see any prospects there for further liberalization? How do you see the role of the IDB in that area?
We are always trying to boost productivity, and we do believe that on the trade areas, there are some places where getting agreements or getting more of we have so many different agreements, if we can coordinate them, that can generate you quite a bit of productivity. I do believe that there is a new momentum on the Mercosur-EU agreement. I don't know if they're going to reach an agreement, but I see that there's a new willingness, at least, to get things done. If they're going to get or not, I don't know. But the role of the IDB is to provide information and to help. Information is to say, this is what you gain from this agreement. Information about what can you do to standardize, to help coordinating the trade between the countries, with the regulations. All of this is important for the region, and it's what the IDB should be doing.
More sort of somewhat separately from new trade agreements, there's been quite a bit of talk about nearshoring and friendshoring, especially here in the US. I always think that's just code for protectionism against the other countries, not so much for expanding trade locally or with allies. But how do you think of that? Do you see a shift from East Asia, Southeast Asia toward the Western Hemisphere in terms of trade the US does, or do you think that's not really happening yet?
Well, I think if we talk about regional integration, and we talk about unified Americas, you're also talking about more trade. But I think the way we think about it is a constructive way, in the sense that the more trade we have between us, the more we get into productivity and the more we can actually share our values. So I think integrating the Americas is the way to think about it, because it's in a positive way to do it.
Very good. Let's, we have about 10 minutes left. Let's take a couple of questions from our both in-person and online audience.
Okay.
Any questions here, please raise your hand, and then I'll call on you, wait for the mic. But I'm going to start with a question here that I received from Charlie Kimball on the internet.
Yeah.
It says, is there much different in long-term growth outlook between various countries that you could group as however you want, authoritarian, democratic, etc.? You emphasize the importance of the rule of law. Do you see countries really going onto different growth trajectories depending on their political regime? Is that something you have thought about?
I think there's a literature about that, but what I can tell you is that when you have instability, and that's not only economic instability, but political instability, or the perception that there is more uncertainty than risk. Risk means that you can actually calculate and see what is the return and what are the probabilities that it's not working, but you have uncertainty that things will come out of the unknowns, things that you really don't know. This is where I believe the impact on investment, impact on productivity, and a lot of what these regimes bring is sometimes there's a lot of uncertainty.
See, that makes sense to me. Questions from here? Otherwise, yes, please. Let's go over here. Please wait for the mic and then introduce yourself and ask a question.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. How has the use of the internet changed your operation?
So we are fully into the digital transformation. And that has two sides. One is the digital transformation inside. So it makes us be more agile and we can work better. And if you're very digitalized, you have databases, and databases are important. Databases are part of knowledge, because if you have a database, you have information. If you have information, you have knowledge. And if you have knowledge, that's the way you can get into the productivity. Now we have AI, which also needs information, which also needs digitalization. So that's something very important. So that's in terms of corporate for the inside. But for the outside, we are promoting digitalization in the countries. And we're promoting in countries that can benefit a lot from the fact that they don't have so much productivity in some places, sometimes in their own government, and it takes too much bureaucracy, sometimes out of that. So we promote it. We promote it with the policy loans, but we talk about it. So you have loans that says, we are going to transform digitally, and here's our help. We promote by having technical assistance. We go there and help them to do that. But it is clear that in this world, you need to have digitalization if you want to benefit from the innovations. I mentioned that distance and digital health. I mentioned digital education. You need the digital part to get these innovations. And AI is just one of them that we will need to be there.
I have another question here. Managing immigration flows from the region has been a major priority for the Biden administration, from Central America, but also from Venezuela, Colombia, and the Caribbean countries. What do you see as the IDB's role in migration policy? Is there anything separate and above from development policy, or do you see it as a separate area of policy? Do you make, or?
Yes, so we are one of the few development banks that actually have a focus on migration. We have a migration fund, and how do we work on that? We look at the countries where we have a migration, a lot of migration either for the US or for Venezuela. You know that Venezuela was one of the major migration of the world, 80 million people, not necessarily to the US, but also to the US, but to Colombia, to Brazil, to Chile, to others. So there is a migration issue, and how does the IDB work? First, it provides assistance to the migrants, but in a lot of the countries, it provides the capacity to generate the roots in the original countries. So you don't have jobs. If you don't have jobs, this is a factor that pushes you to leave. So let's provide them the job. How do you provide them the job? You have to provide them the skills. So we are there with the program of skinning the population. And we have programs that actually give skills to the returning migrants so that they don't go in this circular, they go back and forth. So you provide them, you incorporate them. So we provide also, and then that part is development. If we provide the right infrastructure, the right education, then it's also a factor of stability. So yes, it's an issue for the IDB.
Next question, I'm going to ask you both the narrow original version and a broader version. You can
Yes.
choose which one to answer.
You say original, new, or
Huh?
what are the three?
The first one is the first question I'm going to ask you is the narrow original version that I
Okay.
received, and then I will give you a broader version you can answer if you prefer.
Okay.
The narrow original one is, you're a former central banker. Do you think Argentina should adopt the US dollar and get rid of its central bank? The broader version is,
I'm looking for the border.
the broader version is, what is your assessment of monetary policy in the region right now? Are countries getting it more or less right? Should they tighten faster? Should they loosen faster?
You should give it the two hard ones or two very easy ones. But you give a hard one and an easy one. So let me go with the easy one for now. The central banks of the region have done a great job in this last cycle. They were the first to react to inflation. They were the first to tighten. They maintained the credibility. And now we are actually getting the fruits out of that. So inflation has gone down, not completely, but faster than other places. They're now in the process of reducing interest rates, while the rest of the world is still discussing whether you need to raise it more, you need to raise it for longer. But the region is already starting with the easing process. And I can give you examples. Chile, Brazil, and others are already at the beginning of the process of easing. Of course, the reason for that is not because you have intrinsic better monetary policy, but as I always believe is the needs generates the skills. So central banks of the region already lived for high inflation, medium inflation, and they know how sticky it is and how fast you need to act in order to be able to deal with higher inflation.
It's a bit like how every Argentinian you meet knows a ton about price indices and stuff. Yeah.
So you have this idea that you're not going to allow inflation just to stay there. You're going to act fast. You're not going to allow it to go. So that helps the region deal with inflation.
Awesome. I'm going to ask one last quick question.
Yeah.
I'll make it a little hard. The previous one, the easy version I produced of that question was too easy. I shouldn't have given you the escape hatch.
Yeah, that's my hint. Either you give too hard or
That's right. If you look ahead to your mandate, what's the one thing you really want to accomplish at IDB?
I want people at the end of the mandate say, we really made a difference. We chose specific, we're really having an impact, and I know where is the impact. A general idea that we spent years doing a little bit of each is nice, but is not what I would like to be remembered. I'd like to be remembered that we chose to deal with, I don't know, our second priority, adaptability to climate, and we really made the countries more resilient and we can see it. Or we decide to have an Amazon Forever program, and it really made a difference.
And the Amazon is still there.
And Amazon is still there. That's important because it cannot be there, right?
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, greetings and welcome back. And thank you all for sticking around for the second part of our event this afternoon. The third part of our event, by the way, for those of you here, includes wine and cheese. So you might want to stick around after that, and it'll be great if we could chat a little bit. As Stan mentioned earlier, I'm Steve Kamin, Senior Fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome our panel of highly distinguished experts to shed some further light on the economic and social challenges faced by Latin America and the Caribbean, and what the IDB can help to meet those challenges. So the way we're going to do this is each of our panelists will speak for a few minutes just to get the ball rolling, and then we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves. And then after that, we'll take some questions from you in the audience, both virtually and in person. So we will start at the far end with Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, who is a managing director of Aurora, which is a geopolitical and macroeconomic advisory service. And he is also a professor at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. And then, in an order that has apparently nothing to do with the way we're seated, we'll turn to Nancy Lee. I just do what they tell me, who is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, and has had a long career before that, including, among other things, not that long, okay, being an official at both the IDB and, when I knew her, when I was working back at the Fed, at the Treasury Department. And then finally, Ana Maria Ibanez is a vice president for sectors and knowledge at the IDB itself. And that follows a career as a researcher in Colombia. So without further ado, let's hear what Daniel has to say.
Well, first of all, thank you for covering this important topic and for inviting me to be with you all today. I would say that Latin America right now, it's hard to not get very caught up in the excitement over nearshoring in the short term to medium term, and greenshoring in the medium term to long term. And there's a ton of narratives that are actually driving big inflows of FDI and that are actually having some political impact. You know, I'd say the division between countries where there is a ton of enthusiasm, sort of a palpable sense of things are going to get better soon, and countries that feel that they're being sort of left behind, and that is a little bit more sort of bipolar right now than I think I've ever seen it before. In part, I think this reflects a few changes. One, it's been a good several years for technocracy, generally. This is something that was touched upon earlier, but central bankers in Latin America, some of them are kind of like movie stars now. Brazil being sort of the case in point. And that's something that's very new for Latin America. And that gives, a potential, optimism for the next time some populist tries to push the central bank into doing whatever makes short-term political sense for the populist. The central bank institutionally might have a little bit more gravitas to say no. It could make things easier. So that's the good news. The not so good news is that I think you would have to go into the early 19th century to find a time where Latin American presidencies were as weak as they are now. That's not necessarily a terrible thing, but it means that governance generally has just gotten a whole lot harder. Basically the framing I would use is that for the last 20 years, nearly every country in Latin America was terrified of becoming Venezuela. And I get it, because as of being Venezuelan myself, we didn't want to become Venezuela either. But while they were focused on not becoming Venezuela, they all kind of turned into Peru. And that was something that I think people didn't necessarily see coming. But you essentially have presidencies that are kind of disposable at this stage. You have more impeachments than you've ever had in Latin America. You have tremendously powerful Congresses that have a lot of trouble being proactive, but they're very good at sort of corporate sort of playbook to establish the strength of the institution, which long-term isn't necessarily a bad thing again, but it means that maneuvering from a policy standpoint gets a whole lot harder. You have in several countries judiciaries that used to be very pliant before the executive now are sort of answering to the legislature, which is something we've never seen anywhere in Latin America. So it makes it so that the ideology becomes less important. And to be fair, Peru's going through a rough patch now, but for about 18 years, it was the growth and market superstar in Latin America, even though they shut a president every 2 years. And the currency would barely fluctuate as a result. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a very new thing. And I think that it's something that investors, markets, and institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank have to sort of process, that the sort of power structure within a lot of governments has changed. We see it, for example, with Brazil in Congress or with Colombia in Congress. The elections that are happening on later this month will matter a lot more because of the impact that the governorships and the mayoralties can have on the Congress. So it ends up so that the old archetype of Latin American governments are the president and friends has shifted. And hearing what the president says, or more often tweets, which markets still react to very much and which the citizenry still reacts to very much, is probably less important now than it was previously. And that creates a lot of confusion. And then the last thing I'd say is that people tend to divide the governments into sort of ideological camps. And I think that ideology, too, has become a lot more heterogeneous. You have López Obrador in Mexico saying that Pemex is the only thing that matters and that oil sovereignty is the way of the future. And then you have Gustavo Petro in Colombia saying that oil is the poison that is destroying his homeland. And they're both self-identifying as leftist. Ideology has become more a sort of identity politics for leaders to get votes with than it is really a playbook of actual policies, which I'd say would be different from what we saw in the early 2000s with what they called the pink tide, in which it was always a matter of degrees, how institutionalist you were, or how pragmatic you were that made you, Lula's first government versus a Chavez. The ideological spectrum was still sort of on two dimensions, but it was a difference of where you were on that spectrum. Today, there isn't really one spectrum on the left or the right. And that, makes it much more difficult for countries to coordinate amongst themselves. Because you can have ideological affinities, but very little in common in terms of what you want to do, and you can have a lot in common because of what you want to do, but identify ideologically in a way that makes doing something with certain partners difficult. And I feel I'm running out of time, but you should probably ask about the geopolitical situation writ large and the growing role of China too, because I think that's the sort of last thing that is very relevant to what's going on.
Okay, well, I get the hint, but could I ask you something else
We call it an indirecta.
as a little follow-up before we go on to hear what Nancy has to say? So I'm intrigued. Number one, I'm intrigued by your comment that it's not so much ideological divisions that seem to be most important in Latin America, but more what sounds to me like some kind of a stalemate in governance centered around their Congresses. But so I'm interested in whether that, in your view, that poses an obstacle to the economic reforms that Latin America needs to grow. But I want to just push a little bit further on that, because it sounds, because clearly in Mexico, AMLO seems like a pretty important determiner of economic policies, and it's one that has not been for the best in that country. And similarly, in Argentina, the Peronist regime also has been a rather ideologically clear and empirically clear obstacle to economic and productivity growth in the region. So I'm just saying, so two of the big three do seem to, be countries where ideology in the presidency has been important. So can you comment on that?
Sure. So AMLO, I agree absolutely. To be fair to AMLO, I think that some of the things he's done structurally, I never thought that I would see a Mexican government that's this coherent, for good or for bad, as what AMLO has managed to accomplish in terms of just centralizing authority into Mexico City. That has been impressive. And as, speaking as someone who had a really bad populist once upon a time, AMLO is, he cares passionately about 6 things. One of them is energy. If you are affected by one of the 6 things that AMLO cares passionately about, you are in a lot of trouble. But a lot of people are not affected by the 6 things that AMLO cares passionately about, and then AMLO just basically lets you do whatever you want. I mean, the north of Mexico right now is essentially its own country in terms of the regulatory aspect, which is good and bad. It's bad because there's very little security support from the central authority, so you have crime and cartel actions that are coming out of control. So that's the bad side, but the good side is that state governments are able to attract a ton of FDI, at least some state governments are, and sort of play into this nearshoring narrative that AMLO has, played with, but hasn't really gone all in on because of his own pathologies. So I think AMLO is probably one of 3 presidents who I would say really matter, and the others are in countries like Dominican Republic or El Salvador, which are pretty small. Paraguay, you can make a case for, maybe. But by and large, Argentina, it's, the Peronists are in control, but it's not the Peronist in the presidential palace. It's the former Peronist who is his vice president, who's also head of the Senate, which is part of the problem of the dynamic within Peronism. And Peronism isn't really an ideology. It's sort of a power mafia that sort of masquerades as a political party and that can swap ideologies in and out. It's not to think of it coherently the way one would, some other political parties in Latin America is probably a mistake. What we're seeing right now in Argentina is, I would agree, interesting. But Fernandez hasn't actually managed to legislate very much. And that's with Argentina being one of the very few Congresses where you still had 2 parties or blocks of parties in play. With Milei coming in, even if he loses, you're going to have a 3rd, which is going to completely transform the dynamics within the Argentine Congress in a way that no case in modern Latin American history can you find the addition of new parties into Congress as something that makes legislating easier. It always makes it harder. All of these presidents are backed by coalitions of parties, even AMLO, and sometimes dependent on them for majorities, which means it tends to make you, regardless of what you seek to do, more moderate, just because you have to buy support from different parties that won't support you necessarily. I mean, that's been kind of, a Brazilian friend of mine once told me that the secret to Brazil's moderation is that if Cardoso had wanted to be Pinochet, he couldn't have afforded to bribe the PMDB long enough to legislate that way. And if Lula had wanted to be Chavez, he couldn't have afforded the PMDB long enough to be able to set that policy in action. So, there will be a moderating effect by the weakening of the presidency, but you'll also have much less, a much more sluggish government. And we saw that during the pandemic, where Latin America had a really hard time reacting.
Lots of food for thought there, but there's different plates we can eat from. And so I'll try to get back to China, which is very important, but let's hear about the broader international financial sphere from Nancy.
Thanks, Steve. Well, let me start by saying, Danielle has sort of described this mixed, very interesting political picture. President Goldfajn described a moment of inflection with a lot of opportunity, although he did say opportunity could be lost, as it has been in the past in this region. I'm going to focus on the sort of gathering storm of risks for this region as well as the global economy. Both external shocks and internal weaknesses I would say present real and present dangers. If you look at the growth projections for 2024, this region has among the lowest growth projection of any developing region at somewhere around 2%. Consistent with what Danielle was saying, low growth and low productivity have real social and political consequences. The latest IMF World Economic Outlook has this very interesting graph which shows that Latin America and the Caribbean is the region with the highest percentage of countries experiencing serious political unrest in 2023, which is really quite a conclusion since 2023 has been a pretty tough year. So all of this trains the spotlight on an institution like the IDB, which, as the president said, is the partner, the trusted partner of countries of the region. So the question is, will it respond effectively to both the urgent short-term challenges and the long-term challenges like climate? But let me just broaden the picture a little bit and talk about the larger context for IDB performance. The global financial architecture itself is in the spotlight to a degree that I've never seen in my, as Steve said, lengthy career.
Your medium-length career.
Well, you know, it's pretty long. It is front and center, particularly in the G20. Shareholders, both borrowing shareholders and non-borrowing shareholders and other stakeholders are really coming to the view that whatever their limitations, these are the institutions best suited to help countries meet these local challenges and global challenges. They have the tools, the knowledge, the presence on the ground, all of the things that President Goldfajn was talking about. And for the largest shareholders, they are a good financial deal. The capital from those shareholders is multiplied many times over in lending capacity. But there is an equal recognition that these institutions are not fit for purpose for the 21st century. I would describe them as unique and highly valuable assets, but underperforming assets. And I think that's actually one of the few things that borrowing shareholders and non-borrowing shareholders agree on. So as a consequence, let me predict that we may well see more change in the MDB model in this decade than we have seen at any time since these institutions were originally created in the middle of the last century. A year ago, everyone was talking about MDB evolution. Now, everybody's talking about MDB transformation. So the bar for judging the performance of the IDB and the IDB's president is much higher than it has been in the past. What do we mean by transformation? What I would say very briefly is it's sort of embodied in a comprehensive report that was just produced for the G20 by a group called the Independent Experts Group. It was co-chaired by Larry Summers and N.K. Singh. And the report basically recommended adding global public goods formally to the missions of the MDBs. It advocating a tripling of annual MDB finance commitments to nearly $400 billion a year by 2030, a new approach to country engagement, measuring success in terms of outcomes, as President Goldfajn said, impact, not by finance inputs, very consistent with what the president said, reinventing the approach to mobilizing private finance. So there's really a quantum leap in that performance, and it pushes for the MDBs to act together as a system, which is something people have been arguing for a long time without very much impact at all. So let me just briefly point to 4 promising signs from the IDB. First, the president has been outspoken in supporting the full reform agenda, what he has called in the past the paradigm shift. Second, IDB Invest, the private finance arm, is the only such entity that puts mobilization of private finance first in its corporate strategy as opposed to the volume of its own finance. Third, the president is not shy about setting priorities and focusing on impact. And fourth, he's very clear-eyed and honest about risk, which is something that not all of the leaders of the MDBs have done. He avoids the term de-risking and instead focusing on redistributing risk to the actors that are most able to bear and manage different kinds of risks. At CGD, we have begun what we call an MDB reform tracker across the 6 biggest institutions. And I'm happy to say that our tracker at the moment, it's evolving, but at the moment, the IDB is among the strongest performing institutions. So let me just close with a thought experiment. Let's say we jump ahead to 2030 and we imagine what success in reform of the IDB might look like. First, we go to the website and we find corporate and country targets that are defined in terms of outcomes, climate outcomes, social outcomes, productivity outcomes, not finance inputs. We find that they're publicly tracked. We find that they're publicly reported. And for the first time, it means that shareholders can compare how much money the MDB spent to what the outcomes produced are. So it can actually, people can assess value for money. Second, we find that the IDB has quadrupled its mobilization of private finance by taking a whole-of-bank approach that brings the public sector-facing tools and the private sector-facing tools together. It uses IDB Lab, which is an organization that I was part of for a while, as a way to finance early-stage innovation, which then creates more pipeline for later investments by IDB Invest. It offers private investors the opportunity to help capitalize the IDB by the issuance of hybrid capital. It regularly offloads performing portfolios of assets to the private sector to free up capital for more lending. Its product offerings are no longer dominated by plain vanilla loans. It instead uses more catalytic products for countries that, after all, many of which already have market access. They just need better terms and better targeting to capital market gaps. And finally, collaboration across MDBs, at least by the IDB, is no longer an exception. It is the norm. So all of what I've just described sounds very sensible, doesn't sound particularly revolutionary, but I just want to emphasize that in the context of the MDBs, it is actually a radical agenda. It's not at all assured that it will be implemented, but I think what is assured is that if it is not implemented, there will be an increasing pressure and really an increasing rationale to invent new institutions because the old institutions are really not serving the purposes that and the challenges we're confronting.
Thank you. If I could just, well, I should note first, I did read the executive summary of the triple agenda report. It was interesting. It was, for someone like me that's not really schooled in that area, it was a little abstract. And I was wondering if, it sounds, and then from your description, it sounded like a lot of the reforms are intended to better able to monitor success, in terms of their policies, rather than actually change the way, lending and other engagements with the client countries are actually done. I was wondering, could you be a little bit more concrete, maybe using words of 2 syllables or less, just to kind of explain, like in the new regime, if it were well followed, like how would the IDB and or the World Bank, like how would they change the loans, the types of loans that they make, or for what purposes, or for what sectors, just to flesh that out a little?
Okay, so let me be very concrete. And starting with engagement with countries. The new approach would be to have a country-owned strategy that would define the commitments of the country, policy commitments of the country, investment commitments of the country. It would define the commitments of the MDBs, and it would define the commitments of other development partners. How is that different than things now? Now you have each MDB defining its own country partnership strategy, with its own priorities, its own policy conditionality, rather than putting the country at the center of a sort of hub and spoke structure where the MDBs are all contributing to a central set of commitments, including defined outcomes. You have the MDBs essentially operating based on their own strategy. So that's a very different mode of engaging with countries. Second, on the private sector engagement side, MDBs are, after all, banks. They have an interest in maximizing the value of their own transactions, and that very much influences the behavior of the private arms of these institutions. When they develop transactions, they want a large piece of those transactions so they can earn the returns of those transactions. That is a fundamental driving motivation. They also don't want to take a lot of risk because their risk-adjusted returns will be affected. This new way of approaching private finance transactions is rather for the MDB to find where the capital market gaps are, which is usually not in senior loans, but rather in the riskier parts of the capital stack. Take those riskier parts and also use the policy parts of the bank to help reduce risk.
Take a second to drink some water there. I often induce that reaction in people.
To help manage that risk by actually having the policy and the regulatory and the institutional reform parts of the bank improve the investment climate and also improve the quality of the investment transactions. So you bring together the risk mitigation parts of the bank with the project finance parts of the bank. They take more risk, but that's offset to a significant degree by the improved investment climate. That's what is called a whole-of-bank approach. It's been talked about for a while. It doesn't really happen to a significant degree. And then finally, the engagement with other banks. There is a lot of risk out there in these investments, particularly in poorer countries. It would be very sensible if the banks collaborated on transactions to share that risk, to share the exposure, to take different parts of transactions and allow riskier transactions and bigger transactions because the banks are operating together to share the risk. That doesn't happen now. What happens now is essentially banks compete for transactions because what they're really focused on is the volume of their own transactions as opposed to impact, risk management, and scale. So these are pretty fundamental differences in the way these banks operate. The one last thing I would say is shareholders have to be supportive of all this. Shareholders have to support the absorption of more risk by these institutions. And one way they have to do that is they have to be prepared to put more capital in these institutions. That's the only way you're really going to be able to accept a real significant change in risk tolerance.
Well, I'm sure that the shareholder governments will be eager to put more of the taxpayers' money in that pot. Why don't we now turn to our last, but not least, expert, Ana Maria, to tell us a little bit about your views as to everything you've heard.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much, Stan, for the invitation to be here today. What I will do in my introductory remarks is to do like a double click on what President Ilan Goldfajn mentioned And so I will talk about the 3 priorities that we have at the IDB, show a little bit what's happening and which are the challenges. Then go in depth a little bit more on productivity growth, on low productivity growth of the region, and then what the IDB can do to help the governments in the region. So let's first go to which are the challenges of the region and the challenges that we, IDB, are prioritizing. The first one is poverty and the social issues in the region. And when you look at the region, this is an important issue. About 1 of 3 people in the region are poor. And Latin America is one of the regions with sub-Saharan Africa with the largest inequality or highest inequalities in the world. Inequalities have many impacts, but one that is having an important impact at the moment is the sense of frustrations of the citizens, which Daniel alluded to a little bit. So citizens feel that the governments are not providing the services and the needs that they have. And so we really need to help governments to invest more in the citizens, but also to invest much better. The second one is one that the President Ilan Goldfajn mentioned many times, is the productivity gap challenges that we have. If you look at what has happened in the region with productivity during the last decades, productivity in the region really has not increased. It has remained stagnant for a very long time, such that the growth in the region has been the result of more labor and more capital, but not of productivity increases and not because of innovation. So unless this really changes, what we're going to have is what Nancy mentioned, a growth that is around 2%, that is going to hover around 2% of GDP. And this is a growth that is going to be insufficient, and it's insufficient to lift the millions of people that we have in poverty out of poverty, but also to have a thriving region with economic growth and a dynamic region. The third one is climate change. And climate change, I would like to talk about 2 issues, mitigation and adaptation. And the region is extremely vulnerable to climate change. First, when we look at mitigation, of course, this is a global challenge, but if the region wants to meet the Paris goals, we would need to invest about between $430 billion to $1.3 trillion to meet the Paris commitments. But when we look at adaptation, which is very important, the region is very vulnerable. Almost 1 in 3 citizens in Latin America have faced a natural disaster during the last 2 decades, and that's important. And what we see is that the most vulnerable citizens are the ones that are hit the hardest by these natural disasters. And this year, we are having the droughts in, for example, Argentina and Uruguay and in the Amazon, and this is something unprecedented. And this is only going to intensify. Not only intensify, but it's going to be more frequent. And of course, context matter. What we know and what we have already talked about is the region needs to meet all these challenges with high fiscal deficits. We have several fiscal constraints. Currently, the fiscal deficit in the region is on average 3.1%. It has decreased since the pandemic. During the peak on the pandemic, it was about 7.1%. But the main fiscal problem that we have at the moment is the service of the debt. What we pay, or what the region pays each year in debt, is the same that we pay for education and health. So that's significant and that's important. So we believe that multilateral development banks can play a very important role also to help what Nancy was mentioning, to mobilize private capital to also help with the needs of the region. So let me go and do a double click in productivity growth and what's happening with productivity. As I said, productivity in the region has remained stagnant since the 1960s, or more or less. I'm being a little bit exaggerated, but it has not grown for many, many decades. And what you see is that the growth, for example, since the 2000s, was the result of the commodity boom, and it was the result of the incorporation of the young population into the labor force. The commodity boom ended, and the population is aging. Latin America is one of the regions where the population is aging more rapidly. So we don't have those levers of growth at the moment. And so the reasons for low productivity, low growth are manifold, but I'm just going to mention some. First one, education. We have invested in education, of course, we have progressed with that, but we still have a long way to go. We expanded access to education, but the quality of education is low at the moment, and it has been for many years. So when you look, for example, at 9-year-olds, only 30% of 9-year-olds are meeting the basic math standards, whereas when we look to countries to similar levels of development, this figure is 66%. So there we have a job to do, which is important. Another source of low productivity is labor markets. Informality in the region is widespread. One reason is that we have very high labor costs, in particular when we compare it with productivity. So what private firms do is to hire informally many times the employment. But also there is a part that is important, that is lack of incentives for private firms and the enabling environment for private firms to thrive. So what we have is that on average, 1 in 2 people that are employed work on the informal markets. And we have places like Peru, which is 70%, and the Caribbean region, which is 80% of the labor force in informality. And of course, informality drags down productivity and it erodes the tax base. The third is innovation. We don't do much innovation. We spent about 0.65% of our GDP on innovation, 65%, yes, of GDP on innovation. And when we looked at OECD countries, this number is 2.74. So we are very far behind on innovation. And our infrastructure is lagging behind, and it's lagging significantly. So there we have some challenges. So what can we do at the IDB to help address these issues? Of course, we can do all the credits and operations and the support, the financial support that the IDB can do. And we are doing that. But we also believe that the IDB can play a crucial role with technical cooperation and technical assistance for countries to implement some reforms that may unlock all these obstacles that are preventing us to grow and to provide opportunities to the population. The first one is social protection system. The region has evolved. We have somehow a good social protection system in some countries, in others it's quite weak, but we really need to improve the social protection programs that we have. We need it to be effective, we need it to be adaptive, and effective in a way that it really reaches the neediest and most vulnerable groups of the population, and adaptive to climate change and to negative income shocks such as the pandemic, which we did a very poor job during the pandemic for Latin America, in Latin America. But of course we need growth and we need investment. And so what can we do to boost productivity? There we need many reforms, and we need reforms that reduce the low incentives to innovate, to remove all the barriers to invest in human capital, such that the human capital really increases in the region, to develop our financial markets so that they provide more credits, and credits at a much lower interest rate because we have higher interest rates in the region. And we have a business environment that is fraught with regulations, and fraught with regulations that really impede growth. And we also have a lot of micro-regulations that make it very difficult for firms to operate on a daily basis. And lastly, we have weak competition. So we really need to implement all those reforms such that, that we can really grow much more. President Ilan already mentioned about our capacity to be a clean powerhouse. Our energy matrix is quite clean. We have rare minerals, but at the IDB, we are very mindful that it's important that this commodity boom that may come, it's different than the previous one, such that it's not a commodity boom that came and went and didn't leave much behind. Or it did, I am exaggerating. And the second thing where we can provide opportunities is food security, but President Ilan already mentioned it. What about the other part of the IDB, the operations? Yes, we need to have much more scale. We can achieve more scale optimizing our balance sheet, and we are optimistic about the reform of IDB Invest to receive more capital, so we would be able to have much more loans, much more capital to provide to our countries, either to sovereign or non-sovereign. But we also have to do innovative financial instruments, and I can talk about that during the Q&A. And lastly, to do smarter integration, which President Ilan already mentioned. So I'll stop there, Steve.
Thank you. It's very informative. Could you maybe just, to get, again, a little bit more concrete, maybe tell us about some policies or programs IDB's done that you thought were particularly successful, and maybe some others where you expected greater things of them than actually occurred?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I would mention one that was particularly innovative, not only for the IDB, but for the region as a whole, which are conditional cash transfers.
Okay.
So conditional cash transfers was an innovation that came from Latin America that was very interesting. It started in Mexico, but then it started to spread throughout Latin America. And the IDB played a very important role.
Is this like the bolsa from the...
Yes, that's conditional cash transfers. It's a transfer that governments provide to households, programs in Latin America. And the IDBs mentioned, one of the big objectives is integration. And I think that has been a little bit elusive in the region. We have Central America that has been able, when you look at all Latin America, the sub-region that has been more successful is Central America. But we still have a long way for integration. And when you try, for example, to travel within Latin America, the prices of traveling within Latin America are very high, for example. So we are really not very integrated. And there we can play a much larger role. And now one of the objectives that we have during these 5 years is precisely to try to help the countries to integrate much better.
Great. I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but I think we have some. And I'd like to offer our panelists the opportunity to add some comments on the discussions we've been having, if anybody would like to.
So I would highlight something that both of you touched on, which is Latin America. I think one of the great tragedies for the region has been that it's lumped together as a region, even when there's countries that have very different situations. So for example, I was just in Chile this last week. I got in this morning. They're having a great El Nino. It's been, I mean, for Chile, it has been fantastic. The changing climate, other than the wildfires, which were tough, in terms of the agriculture being produced, it's been very positive. Argentina missed out on the externality of the Ukraine because of the droughts. Brazil did not, and they're having a very good war in that term. Ecuador, which has a big portion of its export market, bananas specifically to Russia, has had a much tougher time with the Ukraine war. So, I think when you talk about getting people behind certain initiatives as a region, you come across these issues in which a lot of times the national incentive actually cuts against the grain to a certain extent. And that lack of integration that you were highlighting, I think, makes it much more difficult for countries to want to actively support something that might work against their short-term interests, especially at a time when incumbent governments have lost 21 of the last 23 elections, and a lot of them end up going to jail afterwards or having to leave the country. So the stakes just seem very high for, risking unpopular policies, and you've never had really a period in which approval ratings are as low as they are now. So that, I think, makes it, it's a big structural challenge in terms of getting governments that are feeling very risk averse to sort of go, to go in on broader initiatives. And I think that's as much of a challenge for BRIC or for Mercosur as it is for, any other sort of a global cooperation or collaboration initiative. But I think it's an interesting time as a result.
Well, let me just pick up on that because, and also pick up on something that the president was describing, because there is this diminishing trust in government and diminishing confidence that government is going to be able to deliver social progress, let's say, or social benefits. And so you have to ask, and so these are enormous issues. You have to ask, how the IDB can make a difference that is clear to people, as you were saying, is concrete. So if you take social transfers, if it were the case that there was a set of outcomes that are defined as priorities for the country and also for the IDB, which are related to what the benefits of social transfers, whether it's education or immunization or just actual poverty reduction, then that set of programs could have been much more clearly associated with gains that the IDB really helped countries achieve. So I think it makes a really big difference if you choose a few priorities, choose ways to measure benefits from those priorities, make those public, and then have all of the relevant actors coalesce around those same priorities. That's just not what happens now. If you look at your standard, I won't say IDB, but if you look at the World Bank partnership frameworks, they have something like 30 output measures supported by 50 operations, and it's sort of impossible to tell when they've succeeded and when they've not succeeded, because of course they're not going to achieve all 30 objectives. So I think this whole question of prioritization and measuring impact that the president was focused on is really important. And I think if in the case of the social transfers programs that had been done, then governments could point to something that they achieved. They could point to the IDB help in helping them achieve that, and the population could look at something and say, this made a difference in our lives.
Cool. I have a question from our virtual audience. They want to know about China. And yes, exactly. And what are its implications for the regions? And let me put a little bit more flesh on those bones. On the one hand, China represents, kind of a mix. It's a mixed bag for Latin America. More financial support, but more debt, and at the same time, more opportunity to the extent that the United States and other Western allies respond to China with these nearshoring type initiatives. And there was a big question, I know, when I was in Mexico a few months ago about would Mexico be able to take advantage of the opportunities offered by nearshoring. So I was wondering what our panelists had to say about that.
I can start. So with, in terms of China, I think that they've actually been making, despite some of the economic wobbles that have been going on the mainland, they have been making some pretty impressive progress in terms of diplomacy initiatives in Latin America, beginning with the pandemic, where you had Sinovac, which didn't necessarily produce the best vaccine, but which produced a lot of plants that produced a lot of jobs that created pharmaceutical industries in areas of Latin America where there traditionally hadn't been one. And that's something that is something that is created, I think, in some cases, a certain degree of loyalty. China's influence has not been in any way, I'd say, dependent on certain ideologies within governments. You have traditionally right-wing countries like Chile that have had very heavy investment from China. You've had traditionally left-wing countries like Venezuela that have been cut off for being irresponsible, but that before that got significant funding from China. And what we're seeing now, which only in this last year, as the geopolitical divides with the West have deepened a little bit, I think has been just a lot more tactical action. And the case I would use actually would be the recent $7.5 billion loan, credit line that was given to the finance minister of Argentina, who also happens to be running for president, to pay off the IMF in yuan, which is symbolically nice. But while that was the headline, it was, there's this old Jewish saying about how, the miracle of parting the Red Sea wasn't the Red Sea parted, it's that it parted at a very specific time. And this happened at a very specific time where you could have had, the prospect of a default during an election, which if you're finance minister is not necessarily the best look. So that I think is not the, last time that we're going to see a helping hand in a contest where the other candidate says that they want nothing to do with China. That's something that I think is going to take political scenarios and situations in Latin America that are already quite polarized on ideological terms, because everybody knows that they hate all of the governing class, but they imagine that the governing class looks different depending on their outlook. The definition of outsider can change, and I think that that's something that we haven't really seen since the Cold War, and that it really sort of marks a new leaf. We had this big meeting with Colombia yesterday, which is going to lead to more investment as well. I think that there's really a doubling down at a time when a lot of the West is all, very focused, and perhaps rightly so, on the twin crises in Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East. That's a great time to be sort of advancing somewhere, and I think that that's something that's being overlooked in a lot of areas, but it's there's an acceleration, a deepening of ties, much quicker than I would have expected if you'd asked me last year.
Well, I would just say that, though, that things may change in the coming years because what's happening inside China in its own economy. And those who know more about China than I do are arguing that these are pretty dramatic changes. The sort of shift in political policy, the shift in the role of the party, the interference by the party in both the largest private firms, but also in in local areas, in regulatory decisions and policy decisions, means that there's a lot more uncertainty about, as the president was saying before, I don't know whether I should call it the rule of law or whether or stability, sort of political stability. There's a lot more concern about whether the situation will remain stable, whether you can rely on your investments, whether you can rely on your property ownership. And that's causing a pretty dramatic decline in private investment inside China. So I think there's going to be less space for these very large-scale, at least state-driven investments in other countries. And then the second thing I would say is one of the reasons why you need a much bigger MDB system is you need a set of finance that can add to fiscal capacity in fiscally constrained countries in a way that's sustainable. MDBs, as the president said, have longer-term loans. They have loans on better terms, and they also spend a lot more time making sure that the investments are actually productive investments that will contribute to growth and productivity than China has. So I think it is an opportunity for Western institutions that have the capacity to add to productive investment to do that. Again, they need to be bigger. They also need to work together so that they can achieve the scale that China has achieved, certainly in Africa and in some parts of Latin America. So this is an opportunity for Western institutions like the MDBs. Whether they will seize it really depends on whether they will sort of remake themselves to be able to fill that capacity.
Maria, can I assume that you do not value the opportunity to insert the IDB into a deeply controversial geopolitical issue?
No, they have provided great answers. So
That's what I,
Thank you.
that's what I thought. Then we have well, we actually don't have time, but we have a little time for one question from our in-person audience, if anybody would like to ask one. Yes. Can you hold on until we get the microphone so that our folks in the ether can hear you?
Tell us about China. Tell us about Japan, which one time at least was trying to.
I'm sorry, we can't hear you at all.
Okay, you told us about China. Tell us about Japan, which at one point was trying to make its way into Latin America. I haven't heard much about it lately.
I mean, they still have some car factories down there. It's actually funny, López Obrador, one of his many pathologies, we were discussing them before, is that he really would like Japanese investment. He says so all the time. He mistrusts everybody. He mistrusts China and the United States because he considers them both imperialist, but he likes Scandinavian countries that have oil, and so does he, so they don't really have that much to talk about. And then he likes Japan. There's actually been, some outreach from Mexico to Japan, and now with nearshoring, that could lead to potentially some investments there in the automotive industry, particularly. But you haven't seen really that much I'd say, industrial relocation to Latin American markets outside of that specific industry that I know of. I don't know if you know of others.
You go ahead.
and I can talk another way through which Japan, and I would say Korea, is supporting the region. They work very closely with us. We have, besides, they are members of the IDB, so they provide funds to the IDB, but they also provide funds through technical cooperation and trust funds, and they are quite active in the region through that. So they are supporting us with digital infrastructure, they are supporting us with education, disaster risk management, integration, trade. So we have several streams of cooperation with Japan and Korea that support the region in a very active and in a very dynamic way.
Nancy, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, the only thing I have to add is when I was working at the IDB in this thing called the IDB Lab, the Japanese, we had a board of donors that funded us, and the Japanese were among the most active on our board. And they were particularly interested in supporting innovation in Latin America, innovation that was beneficial to the firms that are operating in Latin America, as you said, car firms, materials firms. So they used the lab to test various kinds of business models to solve various problems. But they were quite willing to give us grant funding in order to do that. So I think they view it as a middle income region, sort of different than the poorest parts of the world, where they see a lot of market opportunities, sort of growing middle class market opportunities, and at least they were using that part of the IDB to pursue innovations that would help them do that. I'll give you a very specific example. Yamaha, which makes boat engines, is prevalent in Latin America, and they had the lab experiment with some innovations to develop engine servicing points of service in the Amazon. Because the problem is you were having a lot of broken Yamaha engines in the Amazon, and then they needed some business model to allow those engines to be serviced. So that's what they were using Latin America, or at least my part of IDB for.
Great. Well, I think our time is already passed, but I will just say I've learned a great deal in the last hour and a half. I hope our audience has too. And I appreciate our experts coming and spending their time and expertise and wisdom with us. So Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to the audience for coming, and let's give everybody, especially them, a big hand.